Let's talk about floating. Floating allows us to pull elements to the left or the right in order to create column structure. Although floating an element will not affect the elements that come before it, it will start to affect the way the elements that come after it are positioned. In this example, here the sidebar is floating to the left, and the main content is floating to the right, allowing this two-column structure. Here we can see one of the unintended results of floating elements. So here we have floated the main content to the left, and we floated the sidebar to the right. And remember, anytime you float an element, elements that come after it, or in other words, appear below it, are going to try and pull up beside those floating elements. So in this case, there's room for the footer to fit next to the main content, and therefore it's pulling up beside it. Now sometimes this is intended and we do want content to pull up beside the floated element, but in other situations we don't want the content to pull up beside the floated content, like in this case when we want the footer to cleanly display below everything. In order to get the footer to clear past the height of any floating content, we can use the clear property. If we set footer to clear left, it will clear past the height of anything that's floating left. If we set the footer to clear right, it will clear past the height of anything that's floating to the right. And if we set it to clear both, we have all our bases covered, as it will clear past the height of anything floating above it. Once we set the footer to clear both, you can see that the footer will clear past the height of the main content and stay at the bottom right where we want it. Let's take a look at a real-world example when you might want to float something and have the content that's below it pull up next to it. So in this case, I have a paragraph that's followed by the picture of a kitty cat, and that's followed by 4 more paragraphs. So in this case, let's say that I'd like this picture of this cat to float over to the right-hand side, and I'd like the paragraphs below to then pull up into that available space on the left. So the way we do that is we use a CSS selector to select the image, and then we set the float property to right. So you can see that this image is now floating over to the right, and the 4 paragraphs that were below it are now occupying the space beside it to the left. And you'll notice that the paragraph that was above it was unaffected. So again, whenever you float an element, it does not affect the elements that appeared before it. In other words, this element is unaffected, but it does affect the elements that appear after it. Just in the same way I can float the image to the right, I can also float the image to the left. And now you can see that the text in these 4 paragraphs following after the image are occupying the space to the right. This looks pretty good, but I don't like the way that the text is right up against the edge of the image. So I'd like to add some margin, which is the spacing outside of an element, on the right-hand side and the bottom of the image. Now you remember that the image element actually displays inline by default, and inline level elements cannot accept margin on the top and bottom. I'll have to set this element to display block instead. And now that it's displaying block, I can set the margin to 0 on the top, 20 pixels on the right, 10 pixels on the bottom, and 0 pixels on the left. Now we have some nice spacing around this element. So this looks pretty good, but let's say hypothetically that although we wanted these first 2 paragraphs here to pull up beside the floated image, let's say for whatever reason that we wanted the 3rd paragraph to clear past the height of this floating image. So remember, in order to clear past the height of a floating image, we can use the clear property. So first I will just set up a class on this paragraph, and you can see here this has been given a class of fall below. And we could name this class anything we want. I just chose to call it fall below. So I'll create a selector for fall below, and I'll use the clear property to tell this paragraph to clear past the height of both elements floating left or right by setting it to clear both. Now when I run that, you can see that this third paragraph now is clearing past the height of the floating cat image. And because the fourth paragraph is positioned below that element, and paragraphs are set to display block, meaning that they take up all of the horizontal space, then this fourth paragraph has no choice but to also clear below